Aisha, 5 years old. Femi, she is my daughter, isn't she? Was. You lost them all, Femi. Who is this woman? Femi spun the pen between his fingers twice, 3 times. He had been doing it for 5 minutes without realizing. The boardroom on the 30th floor of Adebayo Holdings had that silence before the storm. The kind he knew well, minutes before closing a 100 billion naira deal. Everyone was breathing slower. The door opened, and his world stopped making sense. Zainab entered first in a wine-colored power suit that left no doubt about who was in charge of that room now. Behind her, holding the hand of a little girl in a blue dress, was the legal director of the Aliyu Group. The girl looked up at Femi with the calm curiosity of someone who had never seen this man before in her life. "Good morning," Zainab said. Her voice didn't tremble one bit. "I am here representing the Aliyu Group. I believe you all know each other well enough to skip the introductions." Femi couldn't answer immediately. 5 years. He had trained his face not to react to anything in any meeting, but he hadn't trained for this. The girl tugged on her mother's hand and whispered something he couldn't hear. And that's when he did the maths without meaning to. 5 years since Zainab had left, and that little girl wasn't more than 5. "Zainab," he said, and his own name sounded strange in his mouth, as if he hadn't used it in a very long time. "I didn't know it was you who would be representing the group. Now you know." She pulled out a chair and sat without waiting for an invitation. "Can we begin? I have another appointment at 11. It was only when she opened her folder that Femi saw the full name written on the first page. Aisha Aliyu. Without his surname, not a trace of his surname. And something inside Femi's chest, something he thought he had buried deep enough never to hurt again, broke in a silent way, without scandal, the way the most important things usually break. The meeting lasted 40 minutes, and Femi didn't remember a single number discussed. He only remembered the girl's eyes, which were his eyes. The same brown that verged on gold that Femi's own mother always said was a trademark of the family. When the 2 teams stood up to leave, he did what he had never done in 10 years of his career. He asked to speak with the other party's lawyer. "In private. I have nothing to discuss with you outside of the agenda," Zainab replied, already gathering her papers, without looking up. 5 years. Zizi. He used the old nickname without thinking, and saw her hand pause in mid-air for half a second before she continued putting things in her briefcase. "You won't even let me ask." "Ask what now?" She looked at him. There was no anger on her face, and that was worse than if there had been. There was just a calm that seemed to have been built at great cost. "You had 5 years to ask anything you wanted. You chose not to ask a single time." She took Aisha's hand and left, and Femi stood frozen in the empty room, looking at the spot where they had been, trying to understand how a woman he let walk away had transformed into this, a person who negotiated billion naira contracts with the same ease she once used to choose the wine for dinner. 5 years ago, Femi Adebayo was 29 and absolutely certain he knew exactly what he wanted from life. He wanted the CEO position that his father still held onto with an iron grip. He wanted the Adebayo name engraved on another skyscraper in Ikoyi. And he wanted Zainab Aliyu, an architect with a modest resume and enormous talent whom he had met at a contract pitch, arguing with him in front of 7 people because his project completely ignored how real people use a space. He married her months later, against everything his family expected of him. "She has no family name, Femi," his mother, Chief Mrs. Funmilayo Adebayo, had said, sitting at the head of the dining table at the family home, with that posture of someone whose back never touched the chair. "She has no background, no inheritance, nothing but a degree and a nice way of speaking. She has more character than anyone who has ever sat at this table, Mama." Femi poured wine for Zainab before pouring his own, a small gesture that had become a habit. That should count for something. Mama Funmilayo didn't answer right away. She just looked at Zainab for a second longer than was polite, a look that assessed and dismissed at the same time. And then she went back to cutting the steak on her plate with a delicacy that felt more like a threat than good manners. The first 2 years were good, not perfect. Zainab had her own pride, the kind that didn't ask for help even when she needed it. And Femi had a habit of deciding for her in matters involving his family, thinking he was protecting her instead of excluding her. But they were good enough for Femi to think, on the nights they stood on their apartment balcony watching the city lights come on, that he had chosen correctly for the first time in his life, without asking permission from the surname he carried. It was in the middle of the 3rd year that things started to crack, slowly, the way a crack in a wall starts, a tiny, almost invisible line that no one notices until the day the ceiling falls in. The first crack had a name, Kiki Adenuga, the only daughter of the owner of Adenuga Consolidated, a conglomerate that held a significant portion of the silent debt Femi's father had accumulated, trying to expand too quickly after the recession. No one spoke of this debt out loud, but Mama Funmilayo knew, and she knew that a marriage between the two families would solve the problem in a way no bank meeting ever could. It's just a dinner, Femi. The Adenugas will be there, and it would be rude for you not to show up with Zainab. He went. Zainab went too, in a dress she had hemmed herself because she didn't have time to send it to a tailor, and spent the entire night being treated by Mama Funmilayo with a cordiality so perfect it hurt more than a direct insult. It was Zainab who noticed first, in the car on the way home, looking out the window without looking at him. Your mother doesn't like me, Femi. I already knew that. What I didn't expect was for her to use you to try something else right in front of me. She just wants to secure the family business. It has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me. Her voice was still calm, but there was a thread of steel underneath. And the worst part is, you didn't even notice. Femi really didn't notice. Not that night, nor in the following weeks, when Esther, Mama Funmilayo's personal assistant of 18 years, started appearing near Zainab's architecture firm with a frequency too strange to be a coincidence. Once to deliver documents, another time just passing by, always with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Zainab mentioned it to Femi once. He laughed, amused by his wife's suspicion. Esther has worked for my mother for almost 20 years, Zizi. She has no reason to be spying on you. He was wrong, and it would take him 5 years to discover the extent of his mistake. The final blow came 3 months later, on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind no one chooses to remember, but that life chooses for you. Femi was in his office when Mama Funmilayo walked in without knocking, closed the door, and placed a brown envelope on his desk without a word. Inside, 3 photos. Zainab sitting at a coffee shop table, with a man Femi didn't recognize at first, their hands almost touching on the table, their faces too close for just a work conversation. At least from that angle, in that specific slice of time the camera had chosen to capture. I didn't want to be the one to show you this, my son. Mama Funmilayo's voice had the perfect tone of maternal sadness. Not a degree more, not a degree less, than what would be believable. But someone had to. Femi looked at the photos for a time that seemed both too long and too short. He didn't ask who took them. He didn't ask when. He didn't ask the man's name, nor why the photo had that strange angle, sort of from above, like someone taking a picture secretly from a balcony, or from behind a pillar. He just felt his own pride, that same pride that had chosen Zainab against his entire family 3 years earlier, turn on its side and choose the easiest version to believe. That night, he came home and didn't ask Zainab anything. He was just cold, distant, the way only an Adebayo could be cold. A coldness trained by generations of people who would rather be silent than admit they were afraid of an answer. What's wrong, Femi? She tried in the kitchen, while he stirred his coffee without drinking it. You've been like this for 3 days. It's nothing. He twisted the wedding band on his finger, a gesture that had become a tic since they married. Just work. She didn't press that night, but she did the following week, and the next, each time with less patience and more fear hidden behind the patience. Until the day Femi, tired of carrying a poison his own mother had put in him, threw the envelope on the living room table and said the only sentence that would repeat in his head for the next 5 years. I thought I knew you. Zainab looked at the photos for less than 10 seconds, then looked at him. And what Femi saw on her face wasn't guilt. It was something more like disappointment. The size of an ocean. This man is Tunde. Her voice came out low, almost without force. My friend since university. The lawyer who is helping me sort out my father's estate, which you never had the patience to ask about. We were at a coffee shop discussing inheritance papers, Femi. And you believe a photo taken from a distance before you believe me. Then explain the angle. Explain why someone took this photo in secret. You explain it. She took a step back, as if needing physical distance to finish the sentence. Explain why you'd rather believe an anonymous photo your mother brought you than 5 years of marriage. He had no answer, and his silence that night was the loudest answer he had ever given in his life. What came next happened too quickly for Femi to follow properly, as if the days had been compressed by a hand that wasn't his. Zainab filed for a legal separation on a Thursday. Femi, still trapped in his own wounded pride, didn't beg her to stay. He thought, deep down, that begging would be admitting he might be wrong. And an Adebayo didn't admit that easily. She left the apartment a month later, taking only 2 suitcases and her work drawings, leaving behind the furniture, the jewelry he had given her, and a note on the kitchen table that Femi reread so many times in the following months, he knew it by heart. Femi, I will not stay here trying to prove my innocence to someone who chose to believe a picture over me. I hope one day you understand what you've lost. Zainab. Just that. No written anger, no longer explanation, no farewell longer than those 4 dry sentences. And it was exactly that dryness that, years later, would come back to haunt Femi in a way he had no idea of yet. Because the Zainab he knew didn't write short notes. She wrote 2-page letters just to say she'd be late from work. That note didn't feel like her. It felt like someone in a hurry, or someone who was afraid. Back in the present, sitting alone in the empty boardroom, the contract folder still open on the table, Femi looked at the name written on the first page again. Aisha Aliyu, 5 years old. He did the maths a second time, slower, as if needing to confirm he hadn't been wrong the first time. Zainab had left the house 5 years and 2 months ago. Femi stood up so fast his chair hit the wall behind him. He left the room, crossed the corridor, ignoring the greetings of 2 directors who tried to speak to him, and reached the reception just in time to see the elevator doors closing with Zainab and Aisha inside. The girl waved at him through the narrowing gap, a small, innocent wave from a child who knew nothing about the silent war that had just started again in her father's life. The elevator closed, and Femi stood there with his hands still half raised in the air, understanding with a 5-year delay that maybe the question he should have asked that night wasn't about Tunde, about the photo, about any of that. The question was much simpler and much harder. What, exactly, had made Zainab leave so quickly, without a fight, without explaining, without even trying to stay? Femi didn't wait for the elevator to come back up. He ran down the stairs, 2 steps at a time, and reached the car park just in time to see Zainab's car driving up the ramp. He had no time for anything but to note the discreet logo on the rear window. Aliyu Group, headquarters in Ikoyi, 2 blocks from his own office. He knew that building. He passed by it almost every week, never imagining that the woman inside had the surname of the daughter he had just discovered existed. That's where he showed up at 5 p.m., unannounced, striding through the reception with the gait of someone used to not being stopped anywhere. I need to see Mrs. Aliyu. The receptionist looked at the schedule, then at him, with the hesitation of someone who recognizes the wrong surname arriving in the wrong place. Mrs. Aliyu has no available appointments today, Mr. Adebayo. He was already walking towards the elevator. She'll see me. Zainab didn't seem surprised when he entered her office. She just closed her laptop slowly, like someone putting something away before someone else can touch it, and stood watching him in the middle of the room, waiting. You don't knock anymore, Femi. Aisha is my daughter. It wasn't a question, and she saw in the second of silence before her answer that it didn't need to be. Zainab crossed her arms but didn't look away. And I had the right to know she existed for 5 years. You had the right to believe me over a photo taken from a distance. Right, Femi? You gave up a lot of them in one single night. He felt his chest tighten, the way it did before he lost a negotiation. That moment when you realize you have a weak hand, but you don't know exactly why yet. I didn't know you were pregnant, because I chose not to tell you. She said this looking at the window, not at him. And it was the first time in their entire conversation that her voice faltered, just a fraction. And it wasn't just pride, if that's what you're thinking. Then what was it? She didn't answer. She just picked up her laptop again, opened it, and went back to looking at the screen as if he had already left the room. We have a closing meeting scheduled for Friday. I recommend that you and your company's board come prepared. The Aliyu Group has acquired 80% of the debt that Adebayo Holdings has with 2 different banks. This means that, as of Friday, I am the one who decides if your company stays afloat or not. Femi stood there, processing it slower than he should have. 5 years ago, his father had a silent debt that no one spoke of at the dinner table. Now, that debt had a face, and the face was of the woman he had lost because he believed a photo. You bought my company's debt on purpose. I bought a financial asset that made sense for my father's portfolio. Zainab finally looked at him again, and this time there was something new in her gaze. Something he couldn't name until much later. If this bothers you, I suggest you bring a good lawyer on Friday. Is this about us or is it about business, Zainab? It's about the fact that 5 years ago, an Adebayo decided the fate of my life in one night, without asking me anything. She closed the folder on the table with a sharp sound. Now, I'm the one who decides. You'll have to get used to that before Friday. I will fight for this company, Zainab. My grandfather built it from nothing. So did my father. For the first time, she looked almost tired, And yet he spent the last months of his life arguing over bank clauses instead of resting, because your family thought a silent debt was more important than a sick man having peace. So no, Femi, I'm not going to make this negotiation easy just because you suddenly remembered you have a daughter. He left the building without really remembering crossing the reception. He spent the rest of the afternoon in his car, parked in some random spot, trying to understand how his 5 years of silence had turned into 5 years of her silence, and a reason she wouldn't give. It was Tunde he sought out next. It wasn't hard to find him. The same law firm, the same name on the website, a small office on the 10th floor of a much less flashy building than the ones in Ikoyi. Femi Adebayo. Tunde didn't seem surprised to see him, just tired. The way someone gets when they've replayed this story countless times in their own head. It took you 5 years to come here. I came to ask about that photo. That photo was about her father's estate. He died 3 months after that day, if you recall. Tunde pointed to a chair. A curt invitation for Femi to sit. I was the family's lawyer. We were discussing whether it was worth fighting in court over a clause the bank had inserted without notice. That's what someone's camera captured from a distance and turned into a reason for you to throw a 6-year marriage in the bin. I didn't know that. You never asked. The sentence came out without anger, which hurt more than if it had. Zainab called me a week later, crying, saying you had believed a photo without even checking with me to confirm. I even offered to talk to you. She said it was no use. Why was it no use? Tunde was quiet for a time too long to be natural. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and glanced at the door as if checking if anyone was outside. You have to ask her that, Femi. It's not my story to tell. There's something I don't know. There's a lot you don't know. Tunde stood up, a sign that the conversation was over. But I'll tell you one thing for free. Ask your mother about a letter. A letter that Zainab signed about 2 weeks before she left the house. Ask her about it and see if she looks you in the eye when she answers. Femi left that office with more questions than when he entered, and a new feeling in his chest, like nausea. The kind you get when you start to suspect you've been playing the wrong game against the wrong opponent for 5 years. That night, alone in the apartment that remained exactly as Zainab had left it 5 years before, he never changed the furniture, never changed the wall color she had chosen. Though he never allowed himself to admit it to anyone, Femi opened a box that had been forgotten at the back of his closet. Wedding photos, a florist's receipt, a drawing Zainab had scribbled on a restaurant napkin on their first date, a crazy sketch of a building she swore she would build one day, with a balcony on every floor, because people deserved to see the sky from anywhere in their house. He remembered laughing at that drawing at the time. He didn't remember ever asking her afterwards if she still wanted to build it. At the bottom of the box, a note he had never shown anyone. Not her farewell note, but an older one from a year before, when they still fought and made up the way couples do. Femi, you listen too quickly, and hear too slowly. One day, this will cost you dearly. Her handwriting. Blue ink. A sticky note stuck to the fridge door after a silly argument about dinner time. He reread that sentence maybe 10 times in a row, sitting on the closet floor at 11 p.m., only now understanding, 5 years too late, the scale of the warning he had already received and not listened to. The next day, he went for lunch with his father, alone, without his mother around for the first time in months. His father looked older than Femi remembered, his shoulders more slumped under his suit. I didn't know about the hospital, Femi, was the first thing he said, even before the waiter brought the water. Your mother handled that side of the business alone, and I preferred not to ask too many questions. It was easier. Easier for whom, Dad? For me. His father didn't look away, which surprised Femi. Your mother has always been the one to solve the uncomfortable things in this family. Since we got married, I learned not to ask how. That doesn't absolve me of anything. It just explains why I didn't see what you also didn't see. The Adenuga deal was to pay off that debt. It was to prevent it from becoming public. His father took a sip of water before continuing. I made expansion mistakes that nearly sank the company 6 years ago. Your mother decided the quickest way to fix it was a marriage that would bring in capital without a scandal. You chose Zainab instead, and I accepted it because deep down, I knew you were right to choose for love. I just didn't imagine the price your mother would demand from you from her to let it happen her way. Femi looked at his father for a long time, trying to decide if that was an apology or a confession. He decided it no longer mattered which it was. The damage had been done 5 years ago, and analyzing the intentions of those who allowed it wouldn't bring back a single one of those days. His mother's house was in Banana Island, a mansion with a French garden that Mama Funmilayo had trimmed every week, even when no one was visiting. She was on the veranda when he arrived, having tea with Esther standing beside her, holding a folder of documents. Femi, what a pleasant surprise. Mama Funmilayo smiled the same perfect smile as always. Sit. I'll have them bring another cup. I need to ask you about a letter. Her smile didn't vanish. It just became a second more rigid than it should have been. A detail too small for anyone else to notice, but Femi had known his mother's face for 32 years and recognized that subtle freeze as he would his own signature. What letter, my son? One that Zainab signed 2 weeks before she left the house. It was Esther who moved first, a nearly imperceptible step back. Her eyes darting too quickly to Mama Funmilayo and back to the floor. Femi noticed. He filed it away the same way he filed a calculation error in a financial report, small, but capable of bringing everything down if pulled the right way. I don't know what you're talking about. Mama Funmilayo sipped her tea, too calm to be true. Who told you this? Does it matter? It matters if someone is trying to confuse you again, Femi. You've been deceived once already. It was the first time in that whole conversation that Femi felt like laughing, a laugh with no humor in it. Yes, Mama, I was deceived once. The question I can't stop asking myself since yesterday is, by whom? He left before she could answer, and on the way to the car, he heard from a distance the low sound of Mama Funmilayo's voice, calling Esther inside, in a tone that was no longer for afternoon tea. The opportunity to see Aisha again came the following Sunday, almost by chance. Zainab sent a short text, asking if he wanted to have lunch with them at a restaurant near the park, just so Aisha can get to know you properly, without an office in the middle. Femi arrived 20 minutes early and spent the whole time not knowing where to put his hands. Aisha arrived running a little ahead of her mother and stopped in front of him, examining his face with a seriousness that didn't match a 5-year-old. You're Femi? I am. Mummy said you work with big buildings. I do. I draw buildings too. She opened a small backpack, took out a notebook full of scribbled pages, and showed him one with pride. A crooked building with uneven windows. This one has a real elevator. Grandpa Aliu taught me how to draw elevators. Femi felt something tighten in his chest, hearing that the grandfather Aisha had never met, referred to so naturally as if he were alive in the next room, as if he were part of a story told so many times it had become the girl's own memory. He taught you to draw elevators? Mummy taught me what he used to teach her. Aisha sat in the chair next to him without asking permission, with the directness only a child has. She says Grandpa liked to build things people could actually live in, not just things that were pretty on the outside. Zainab, sitting on the other side of the table, said nothing. But Femi saw the way she looked at her daughter, saying that a mix of pride and something deeper, more painful, that he recognized because he also felt it inside. The lunch passed more quickly than he expected. At no point did Aisha ask why she was only now meeting her father. And that, in a strange way, hurt Femi more than any question would have. She doesn't know anything, he said quietly, when Aisha went to the restroom with the nanny who had been waiting near the door, about what happened between us. She knows her father didn't know she existed. Zainab stirred the ice in her glass slowly. And she knows that wasn't her fault. That's all a 5-year-old needs to know, Femi. The rest is our problem, not hers. I want to be a part of her life. I know. For the first time, Zainab's voice truly softened, without the armor she had been wearing since the boardroom meeting. But wanting isn't the same as deserving. Not yet, Femi. You have 5 years of absence to prove you won't disappear again at the first wrong photo someone shows you. The following Saturday, Zainab let him take Aisha to the park alone for the first time, on the condition that he text her every half hour, just so I don't go crazy. Not because I don't trust you with her. I'm still not sure how I feel about that. Femi accepted without arguing. Aisha spent the first 20 minutes deciding which swing was the best, testing the 3 available with a scientific seriousness that made Femi laugh for the first time in weeks. This one goes higher, she decreed, choosing the middle one. But this one has shade. It's a tie. So how do you decide? Use both. She shrugged, as if the solution were too obvious to warrant discussion, and got on her chosen swing, asking him to push. While he pushed, gently, careful with his strength, Femi asked, trying to sound casual, "Are you and Uncle Tunde good friends?" Uncle Tunde is funny. Aisha laughed to herself at some memory. He always brings mint sweets that nobody likes, but we eat them because it makes him happy. He was going to get married last year, but they postponed it because their dog got sick. Now they're getting married next month. Femi felt a silly, disproportionate relief at that piece of information, said with no weight at all by a 5-year-old child. The man in the photo had a fiancée, had for years, and was getting married. And the only thing Femi had built on that blurry image was a castle of assumptions that cost him 5 years of his life. Are you sad? Aisha asked, stopping the swing with her feet on the ground, looking at him with that strange seriousness again. No, just thinking about a silly thing I did a long time ago. Mummy says grown-ups make mistakes too. They just take longer to admit it. She started swinging again without waiting for an answer, as if she had just settled the matter for good. Do you admit things quickly or slowly? Femi didn't have a ready answer for that. He just kept pushing the swing, thinking that maybe that was the most important question anyone had asked him in years, coming from the very person who should least have to ask it. Zainab put Aisha to bed that night earlier than usual, the girl still tasting of strawberry ice cream, the scent of sunscreen from the park still lingering on her pillow. She sat in the chair beside the bed until she was sure her breathing had become deep and regular, and only then went to the living room. She poured a glass of wine she wouldn't finish and turned on the computer on the desk near the window. Not to work, but to look again at a folder she had kept for 5 years and never showed anyone. Photos of her father on one of the last days he could still get out of bed on his own, smiling for the camera with that stubborn way of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. He never knew about the letter. She had signed it secretly one afternoon while he was sleeping after a chemotherapy session and never told him, because telling him would mean admitting that her own daughter's marriage had become a bargaining chip for his life. Sometimes, she still wondered if she had made the right choice. Not about signing the letter. That was never a doubt. She would do it again 1,000 times. But about the silence afterwards. About never having sought out Femi when everything was resolved, when the hospital was secure and the threat had passed. She told herself it was for protection. Sometimes, alone, late at night like now, she admitted it was also pride. The same kind of pride she always accused Femi of having, just dressed in different clothes, quieter, more disguised as dignity. Her phone vibrated on the table. A message from Femi, sent too late to be about work. Thank you for today. Not just for the park, but for letting me try. She stared at the sentence for a long time, her thumb hovering over the keyboard, unable to decide what to write. In the end, she didn't reply at all. She just put the phone away, finished the rest of the wine slower than she intended, and stared at the city through the window, thinking that maybe the hardest part of this whole story wasn't discovering the truth, but deciding what to do after it appeared. The Friday meeting filled the boardroom of Adebayo Holdings in a way Femi had never seen. On one side, he and his father, surrounded by nervous lawyers. On the other, Zainab, alone, with a thin folder on the table, and a calmness that seemed to have been trained for moments exactly like this. The Aliou Group is willing to renegotiate 80% of this debt, Zainab began without preamble, without greetings, provided that Adebayo Holdings accepts 3 conditions. First, full transparency in the next financial statements, with an external audit chosen by us. Second, Adenuga Consolidated is completely removed from any future negotiations with our company. Third, she paused and looked directly at Mama Funmilayo, who had entered the room uninvited, sitting at the back with her usual posture. Third, Mrs. Funmilayo Adebayo will not participate in any decision involving the Aliou Group, directly or indirectly, from this day forward. The silence that fell upon the room had an almost physical weight. Femi's father looked at his wife, then at Zainab, not quite understanding the magnitude of what was being asked. This is personal, Mama Funmilayo said, and for the first time in years, Femi heard a thread of nervousness in her voice. It's strategic. Zainab closed her folder. But you know better than anyone why it is also personal. Do you really think you can remove me from a room I helped build? I think, Zainab stood up slowly, in no hurry, that you underestimated one thing 5 years ago. You thought I would disappear quietly and never come back. You just forgot to check which family I truly came from before you ordered that photo to be taken. Femi's father turned to his wife so quickly the chair creaked. What photo, Funmilayo? Mama Funmilayo didn't answer right away, and it was in that second of silence, that long, choked second, that Femi understood, with his stomach turning, that the answer to the question he had been carrying for 5 years was about to come out of the wrong mouth, at the wrong time, in front of too many people. Esther, standing near the door holding a stack of documents, let the folder slip from her hand, papers scattered across the floor, and in the middle of them, face up, was a brown envelope with a date handwritten on it that Femi recognized instantly. It was the same date as the note Zainab had left on the kitchen table 5 years ago. Esther, Mama Funmilayo's voice came out in a tone Femi had never heard before, sharp and frightened at the same time. Leave that. We'll talk later. But Femi had already bent down. He already had the envelope in his hand before his mother could take 2 steps towards him. Inside, not photos this time, A typed letter with Zainab's signature at the bottom and a paragraph that Femi read twice to make sure he was understanding correctly. The letter stated that Zainab agreed to leave the marriage without contesting anything, without contacting Femi, without revealing the real reason for the separation to anyone, in exchange for Adebayo Holdings not calling in a debt that threatened to close the private hospital where her father, already very ill, had been receiving treatment for months. You threatened her father's hospital. Femi looked at his mother, and his own voice sounded strange to him, as if it belonged to someone else. You faked that photo and then threatened to take away her father's treatment if she didn't disappear quietly. I protected this family. Mama Funmilayo finally lifted her chin, no longer feigning surprise. You were in no condition to see what she really was, Femi. An architect with no name trying to climb up using my son. She never asked for anything from us, Mama. He felt his voice tremble, not with sadness, but with a cold anger he had never felt before in his life. She left with 2 suitcases, and you still thought that wasn't enough. Femi's father, silent until then, slammed his open hand on the table, a gesture Femi couldn't remember his father making in 30 years. You used her father's hospital, Funmilayo. A dying man. He was going to die anyway. The sentence slipped out before she could stop it, and her own face changed the next second, realizing too late what she had just admitted in front of everyone. That changes nothing. She tried to fix it, her voice regaining control too quickly for someone who had just been exposed. My husband will never authorize these conditions. And you, Femi, should remember which side of the table you're on. She picked up her bag, turned her back, and walked out of the room with steps that betrayed nothing but the control she always wore like armor. Femi stood there with the letter still in his hand, feeling the weight of 5 years of misdirected anger finally sinking in. Zainab hadn't moved from her spot on the other side of the table, looking at him with an expression that was neither victory nor relief. It was something more like exhaustion, the weight of carrying a truth alone for 5 years finally coming out of her, without her needing to say a word. You knew I would find out one day, he said, quietly, just for her to hear. Why did you never come to me to show me this? Because the first thing your mother did after I signed that letter was show me what happens to people who try to prove something against an Adebayo without the money to fight. Zainab's voice had no anger left, just a deep weariness. I had a daughter to protect, Femi. I didn't have the courage to bet the rest of what I had just for you to believe me. And now I don't need to be afraid of anything your family can do to me anymore. She picked up the folder from the table. And that changes everything. Except one thing. I still don't know if I can trust you again just because the truth came out. Truth isn't the same as change, Femi. I've already seen you choose to believe the easier version once. She left soon after, and Femi followed, catching up to her in the hallway, far enough from the room for no one else to hear. Zainab? Wait. She stopped, but didn't turn around right away, as if she needed a second to compose her face before facing him. What do you want, Femi? I want to say I'm sorry. Not in the easy way everyone says it after they're caught doing something wrong. I'm sorry in a way I don't even know how to prove yet. I know you're sorry. She finally turned, and her eyes were dry, but something in them had softened, just a little. The problem was never whether you feel sorry, Femi. It's that feeling sorry doesn't fix 5 years. Aisha doesn't get back the 5 birthdays you missed. My father doesn't get back the last months of his life that he spent afraid of losing his treatment because of your family. Feelings don't pay those debts. Then what does? Time. She shrugged, a tired gesture, with no hardness left in it. Time. And repeated choices, every single day. To do things differently. One conversation doesn't solve this. A beautiful apology doesn't solve this. It only gets solved if you keep showing up. Even when it's boring. Even when I'm being difficult. Even when Aisha has a bad day and cries for no reason at 3 in the morning. I'll show up. We'll see. It wasn't said with malice. It was said with the exact weight of someone who has heard that promise before, from someone else, and seen it crumble at the first wrong photo. She turned and continued walking, and Femi stood in the corridor, watching her back recede, feeling for the first time that maybe the way back wasn't impossible, just much, much longer than his pride had once thought necessary. It was only when Femi's father also left the room, shaking his head, muttering something about calling the family lawyer, that Esther approached him, her hands still trembling. The papers clutched to her chest like a shield. Esther. Femi turned to her. You knew about all of this the whole time. I did. The words came out so low he almost didn't hear them. And that's not the only thing I know, Mr. Femi. Then speak. Esther glanced at the door, then the window, as if calculating how much time she had before Mama Funmilayo realized she was still in there talking. There's something else, she said, her voice almost a whisper. And Chief Mrs. Adebayo doesn't know I kept it. Esther pulled a chair close to the table, sat without being invited, and for a second she looked older than the 18 years she had worked for that family should justify. I have a recording, she said, her voice still low, glancing at the door every few words, of a phone call Chief Mrs. Adebayo made 5 years ago to the photographer who took those pictures. She told him to position the camera in a specific way. She knew exactly which angle would show what. Why did you record it? Because I had suspected for years that one day I would need some proof that I didn't do these things out of malice. Esther wrung her hands in her lap. My husband had cancer at the time, Mr. Femi. Expensive treatment. Health insurance that didn't cover half of it. Chief Mrs. Adebayo knew this. She offered to pay for the rest of his treatment in exchange for me helping arrange that photo and then keeping an eye on Zainab. I accepted because my husband was dying, and I would have done anything to ensure he didn't die without treatment. That doesn't absolve me. It just explains it. Femi felt the ground shift in a way different from how it had all morning. It was no longer just about him and Zainab. It was a much wider web, with more people trapped in it than he had ever imagined. He wondered for a brief second how many other people around his own family had been bent over the years by the same silent machinery that nearly destroyed his own marriage. Did he survive? Your husband? He survived for another 2 years. Esther lowered her eyes. He died of something else in the end. Pain-free, surrounded by family. But those 2 years I owe to your mother. And that's why I could never summon the courage to speak up before. Every time I thought about telling the truth, I remembered his face in his last days, calm, without suffering, and the guilt would flip to the wrong side again. As if telling the truth would be betraying his memory, not Zainab's. That didn't oblige you to stay silent forever. No, it didn't. Her voice gained a new thread of firmness. But fear is like that, Mr. Femi. It doesn't ask for permission to stay. It just stays. There's one more thing, Esther continued, her voice breaking slightly. 3 months after Zainab left, when her father needed a procedure that wasn't included in the arrangement, I paid for it out of my own pocket. Anonymously. I never told anyone, not because I'm a good person, but because I couldn't sleep at night knowing what I had helped to do. Femi stared at her, trying to reconcile this woman, the same one who had spied on Zainab, the same one his mother had used as an instrument for nearly 2 decades, with the image of someone capable of such a secret act of that magnitude. Why are you telling me this now? Because, Chief Mrs. Adebayo just admitted in front of everyone that she knew Zainab's father was going to die anyway. Esther's eyes glistened with tears, but she didn't cry. I carried this guilt alone for 5 years. I won't carry it for another day. And I think Zainab deserves to know that not everything that came from this family was pure malice. Some of it was just trapped people, trying to survive the only way they knew how. She'll need to hear this from your mouth, not mine. I know. Esther stood up, adjusting the papers against her chest again. I'll go see her this week. I just needed to tell you first, because you are the one who will decide if the Adebayo family still exists after all of this comes to light. Zainab sought out Tunde the night after Esther's confession, sitting in the same small coffee shop where a photo taken from a distance had destroyed 6 years of her life. She told me everything, she said, stirring a coffee she wouldn't drink. The sick husband, the money, the anonymous payment for my father's treatment. I don't know what to feel, Tunde. Part of me wants to hate her forever. Another part remembers she paid a bill that should have been paid by the family that threw me out, not her. You don't have to decide that today. Tunde placed his hand over hers on the table, a brotherly gesture, with no ulterior motive, the way it had always been between them. Forgiveness doesn't have an expiry date. You can be angry with Esther for this whole year and still acknowledge the good she did later on when it makes sense. And Femi? Femi is another question. Tunde smiled faintly. But from what you've told me, he seems to be learning to ask the right questions this time. That's already more than most people manage in a lifetime. Zainab laughed. A short, tired, but genuine laugh. And for the first time in weeks, she felt the weight on her chest lighten by a degree. The family meeting was scheduled for 2 days later at the house in Banana Island, with Femi's father insisting that this gets resolved internally. Mama Funmilayo arrived in the dining room with her usual posture, as if nothing had changed, as if 5 years of secrets hadn't just crumbled on the boardroom table of her own company. Why exactly have you called me here? She sat at the head of the table, her usual spot. To judge me as a family, as if this were a tribunal? For you to hear something. Femi placed his phone in the center of the table, the audio ready to play, and then decide if you still want to deny it. The recording played. Mama Funmilayo's voice, 5 years younger, instructing the photographer with icy clarity, giving the exact angle, the exact moment, the framing that would suggest what wasn't true. At the end, the final line of the recording. I just need it to look bad enough that he doesn't ask questions. I'll handle the rest. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout could have been. All right. Mama Funmilayo finally spoke, and her voice didn't tremble. Which was, in a strange way, more frightening than if it had. I did it, and I would do it again. Because someone in this family had to protect what we've built over 3 generations. You two, she looked at her husband, then her son, have always thought that money protects itself. It doesn't. Someone has to make the difficult choices, the ones no one else has the stomach for. And that person has always been me. You threatened the life of a sick man to do it, Femi said, his voice low, controlled, more frightening to himself than if he were yelling. That's not a difficult choice, Mama. That's cruelty with a fancy name. And what would you have done, Femi? Let the company your great-grandfather built go bankrupt because you were too in love to see the numbers? I would have talked to my wife. He said it looking deep into his mother's eyes, without wavering. That's all I needed to do. And you made sure I never had the chance. You were too weak for that conversation, my son. You still are, if you rely only on your heart. Maybe? He didn't look away. But I'd rather be weak of heart than strong the way you are. At least my way didn't cost anyone their life. Femi's father, sitting at the other end of the table, stood up slowly, his hands resting on the wood. Funmilayo, I am going to ask you to step down from any executive position in the company, formally, as of tomorrow. And I'm going to ask you not to get involved in any negotiation with the Aliyu group. Not formally, not informally, not behind the scenes the way you've always known how to do. You don't have the courage to do this to me. She looked at him with a mix of disbelief and defiance. 35 years of marriage, and you're going to punish me for protecting our son? I'm going to punish you for deciding on your own, throughout our entire life together, that you knew better than everyone else what protection meant. Otumba Adebayo's voice trembled, but it didn't waver. Your son will never see you the same way again, Funmilayo. And I didn't do that. You did. And the company board will just accept this. Just like that? After 30 years of me in there, the board already knows. It was Femi who answered this time. I sent the recording to the other 2 independent directors this morning. Before this meeting started, the vote has already happened, Mama. Unanimous. Mama Funmilayo stood there, looking around the table, at her son, at her husband, at the closed face of Esther, who had returned to the room just to witness this in silence. None of them looked away. She picked up the linen napkin from the table, folded it slowly, placed it back in the exact spot it had been. A small automatic gesture from decades of trained good manners, and stood up. You will all see that running this family without me is not as easy as you think. It was the last thing she said before leaving the room. And her voice, for the first time in the entire scene, had a thin thread of something that sounded, from a distance, almost like fear. Femi thought he would feel relief after that. He only felt an enormous exhaustion, the kind that isn't solved by a night's sleep. The following Friday, at the formal signing of the new contract between the 2 companies, Zainab entered the boardroom for the last time in that whole process. And this time Femi's father was alone, representing Adebayo Holdings, without his wife, without the shadow of manipulation behind his chair. The conditions remain the same, she said, placing the folder on the table. With a new addendum, Adebayo Holdings will fund for the next 5 years a free treatment wing at the same hospital where my father was a patient. It's not charity, it's reparation, with the correct name. Accepted. Femi's father signed without asking to read it twice. And Zainab, I am sorry, not out of duty, but out of shame. I should have asked more questions about how my wife solved this family's uncomfortable things. Late isn't the same as never, Otunba Adebayo. She put away the signed folder. That counts for something. At least, Zainab sat in her car for a few minutes after leaving the building. Alone. The signed contract, safe in the folder beside her on the passenger seat. She should feel victorious. And she did. In a small corner of her chest. The Adebayos had spent entire months feeling the same taste of rejection and uncertainty she had swallowed alone for 5 years. And there was a quiet justice in that which she wouldn't pretend not to feel. But mixed with that, there was also a deep exhaustion. The kind that only appears after the anger finally lands and discovers that underneath it, there is no hatred left, only the tired desire to finally be able to rest. The negotiation with Adenuga Consolidated, which had been cooling for months, was officially terminated the following week. A short statement, no drama, signed only by Femi's father. No one in the family commented on the matter again, and it was precisely that silence, without explanation or apology, that Femi understood as the true end of a chapter that should never have been opened. Femi thought, leaving that room, that the hardest part was over. He was mistaken. 2 weeks later, still caught up in a kind of ill-conceived euphoria of someone who finally understands their own story, Femi decided it was time for a grand gesture. He arranged a dinner at Zainab's house. He asked for permission. He hired her favorite restaurant from years ago to cater, invited Aisha, and in the middle of dessert, in front of the little girl, he pulled a small box from his pocket with the old engagement ring, the same one he had given her 6 years ago. "I know it's soon." He knelt, feeling his own heart beating too fast. "But I don't want another day without you two for real. Marry me again, Zainab." Her face didn't break into a smile. It closed slowly, into an expression Femi recognized too late as contained fury. "Get up, Femi." "Zainab, get up." Her voice cut through the air in the room, and Aisha, sitting in her high chair, looked from one to the other, not understanding how the mood had changed so quickly. "You just did the exact same thing you always do. You decided for me, in front of our daughter, without asking me first if I was ready for this. I know what you wanted." She stood up, picked Aisha up in her arms, even as the girl complained she hadn't finished her dessert. "You wanted to fix everything at once with a grand gesture. Because a grand gesture is easier than the small ones that need to be repeated every single day. I didn't say yes 2 weeks ago when you said you would show up. I'm not going to say yes now just because you brought a ring and an expensive restaurant." She left with Aisha in her arms, and Femi was left kneeling in the middle of the room, the small box still open in his hand, feeling for the second time in his life the exact weight of a door closing. Only this time, he knew with painful clarity that he was the one who had slammed it shut. The waiter approached awkwardly, asking if he could bring the bill, and Femi felt a fool putting the box back in his jacket pocket, like someone pocketing a mistake he would still take time to fully understand. He drove to his own apartment slowly, the streets nearly empty at that hour, replaying the entire scene in his head, trying to pinpoint the exact moment it had all gone wrong, and gradually realizing that the mistake hadn't been the ring or the restaurant. It had been deciding everything on his own. Again. Exactly the way he had always known how to do. Worse, he called his father that night, sitting in his car in the restaurant's empty car park, without the courage to drive yet. "I messed everything up again, Dad." "You did what, exactly?" Femi explained, and his father was silent on the other end of the line for a long time before answering. "Do you know why your mother and I never had a real conversation about anything important in 35 years, Femi? Because every time a problem arose, she solved it quickly, on her own, with a grand gesture, without including me in the decision. I led her because it was easier. You just did the romantic version of the same thing. A grand gesture, decided on your own, to quickly solve what can only be solved slowly. So what do I do now? You show up tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow. No ring, no restaurant, no audience at all, until it becomes a real habit, not a stage performance." The following weeks were different. Femi stopped trying for grand gestures and started showing up for the small things, with no audience to see. He picked Aisha up from school twice in the week the nanny was sick, without telling Zainab in advance he would do it. Just doing it. He sat in the waiting room of his daughter's dentist for 40 minutes on an ordinary Tuesday. He learned, without asking anyone, how to make the jollof rice with extra fried plantain that was the only dish Aisha would eat when she was in a bad mood. One night, Aisha called his mobile, crying because she'd had a nightmare and her mother was on a work call she couldn't interrupt. Femi drove 20 minutes just to sit outside her room outside, singing some random song softly through the ajar door until she fell back asleep. Zainab didn't comment on any of it for weeks. She just observed from a distance, with the cautious silence of someone who has been burned once and learned not to trust a pretty fire. It was on an ordinary night, no special date, no planned gesture, that things finally moved. Aisha had fallen asleep early after a day with a low fever, and Femi stayed late, helping Zainab organize a pile of company papers she had brought home, sitting on her living room floor, without either of them having planned it. "You don't have to stay," Zainab said, around midnight, without looking at him, still sorting contracts into piles. "I know I don't have to." He continued organizing the papers the way she had asked. "I want to." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him for a long time, as if trying to decide something important, in no hurry at all. "I've been angry with you these entire 2 months, you know." Her voice came out softer than anything she had said in recent weeks. Angrier even than in the 5 years I was away. Because in those 5 years, I had gotten used to the idea that you weren't coming back. Now you're back. And I don't know how to protect what's left of me if you leave again. I won't. Everyone says that. She smiled. A small smile. The first real one he had seen from her in months. But you've been showing up. Week after week. No audience. No ring. No expensive restaurant. That counts for more than anything you've said so far. So, does that mean something? It means I'm still scared. She moved closer. Sat on the floor beside him, among the scattered papers. But it also means that maybe this time, I'm scared and still willing to try. It's not the same as being certain, Femi. But it's more than I had 2 months ago. He didn't try to kiss her then. He just took her hand slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't. Can I tell you something silly? He said quietly. I kept the drawing of the building you made on that napkin, on our first date. I still have it. Why? Because it was the first time I saw someone thinking about building something to make people happy, not just to make money. He squeezed her hand gently. I forgot about that for years. I wish I hadn't. Zainab was quiet for a moment, looking at her own hands intertwined with his on the cold living room floor. And when she spoke again, her voice had a small, almost hidden tremor. We'll go slow. No ring again for now. No big promises. Just showing up, day after day, and seeing where it goes. Deal? And the two of them sat there on the living room floor for a while longer, surrounded by scattered papers, feeling no need to fill the silence with any more words. Mama Funmilayo showed up at Zainab's house alone, unannounced, 3 weeks after being formally removed from the company. Zainab opened the door, thinking it was a delivery, and was surprised to see her former mother-in-law standing there, without her usual posture, with a small handbag and a strange way of looking at the floor instead of straight ahead. I didn't come to apologize. It was the first thing Mama Funmilayo said, still standing on the doorstep. I don't know yet if I'm truly capable of that. I just came to say one thing because no one else will let me say it after today. Then say it. I saw Aisha in the garden once, without you knowing. Looking at the building designs she makes, Mama Funmilayo's voice faltered in a way Zainab had never seen in that woman before. She draws the way my father-in-law used to draw, decades ago, before the company became just numbers on a spreadsheet. I forgot that way of building a long, long time ago. Maybe too long ago to realize I also lost something along the way. Not just gained. She didn't wait for a response. She just handed over a small envelope. Inside, a bank transfer in Aisha's name for the exact amount that her father's medical treatment had cost 5 years ago. And she left, walking slowly down the pavement, without looking back. A woman who still didn't know if she deserved to be forgiven, and who, for the first time in a long time, seemed to be carrying that weight alone, instead of pushing it onto someone else. Zainab stood at the door for a long time after the car disappeared around the corner, the envelope still closed in her hand, not yet knowing if she would open it with anger or with relief. She only knew that for the first time in 5 years, looking at the Adebayo surname no longer hurt the way it used to. The night before, Femi had sat with Aisha on the apartment balcony, both of them looking at the city lights, and told her, in the simplest way he could, the summarized version of everything that had happened. I made a big mistake, you know, he said, without beating around the bush, without trying to soften it too much for a child who had already shown she understood more than her age suggested. I believed a wrong thing about your mummy, and because of that I lost 5 years that we could have had together. Will you make a mistake again? Aisha asked. No drama, just genuine curiosity. Probably. Nobody gets it right all the time. But will you keep showing up anyway? Yes. He put his arm around his daughter's small shoulders. I'll keep showing up to fix it. That's the difference I learned too late. Aisha was quiet for a moment, looking at the city lights, and then she rested her head on his arm, without needing to say anything more. For a 5-year-old, that was proof enough of everything she needed to know. On the morning of the wedding, Zainab woke up early, before her alarm, and sat in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand her own nervousness. It wasn't the same nervousness as 6 years ago. That one had been light, hurried, full of the easy certainty of people too young to imagine how much life could hurt. This one was mixed with scars, with caution, with the vivid memory of everything she had traversed to reach this day without losing herself along the way. Aisha came into the room, jumping on the bed, still in her pajamas, her hair tousled from sleep. Today you're really marrying Daddy. Today. Zainab pulled the girl close, smoothing her hair with her fingers. Are you nervous? No. Aisha shook her head with all the conviction of a 5-year-old. I already knew it would work out. You just took a long time to trust again. How did you know? Because he never missed a day again. The girl shrugged, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Grandpa Aliyu used to say that people who stay are the people who show up. You told me that. Zainab felt her eyes sting and hugged her daughter tighter, thinking that perhaps the simplest explanation for all of it had been coming all along from the mouth of a 5-year-old who never needed more than that to understand what real love was. Esther continued to work for the Adebayo family, but now as Otumba Adebayo's direct assistant, no longer as Mama Funmilayo's shadow. On the wedding invitation Zainab sent her, she wrote a short, handwritten note in the corner of the envelope. Thank you for choosing the truth, even if it was late. Esther kept that envelope in a drawer only she opened, next to an old photo of her husband, as if it were finally proof that the guilt she had carried for 5 years had, in the end, served some good. The wedding took place 8 months later. Small, in the garden of the house Zainab had bought with her own money after taking over the Aliyu group. Not the Adebayo mansion. Not the grand church Mama Funmilayo would have chosen, but a simple garden with 40 guests and Aisha as the little bride, insisting on wearing trainers under her dress because you can dance better without fancy shoes. Tunde was the best man standing beside his own new wife, both of them laughing at some inside joke about mint sweets. Femi's father cried without caring who saw, something no one in that family remembered seeing him do before. Esther, sitting in the 3rd row, held a handkerchief and a smile that finally seemed lighter than anything she had carried in 5 years. The white chairs lined up on the lawn swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, and someone had scattered wildflower petals down the path to the makeshift altar. No glamour, no luxury. Just the way Zainab always said she wanted it, if she ever decided to marry again. Mama Funmilayo was not invited to the ceremony, but the following week, she sent a framed drawing of an old building that Zainab's own father had designed decades ago, with a short note for Aisha to keep drawing the right way. Zainab hung it in her daughter's room, without saying anything about it to anyone, just deciding in silence that true forgiveness sometimes doesn't need any ceremony to exist. At the time for the vows, Femi didn't use any rehearsed speech. He just looked at Zainab, then at Aisha, sitting in the front row fiddling with the hem of her dress, and said the only sentence that truly mattered. 6 years ago, I chose to believe the easier version. Today, I choose to show up every single day for the rest of my life, even when it's difficult. It's the only promise I know I can truly keep. Zainab smiled, her eyes wet, and squeezed his hand before replying. Then that's what I'll trust in. Not in one big promise, but in the small ones, repeated, every day, until they become a certainty. Aisha, sitting in the front row, stood up in the middle of the silence after the vows and shouted, without anyone prompting her, "Now you can kiss." And the laughter that spread through the garden was the sound that finally closed 5 years of silence that never needed to exist.